President of ISPP, and I'm here for the first of our plenary sessions, the first of our keynote addresses with Dr. Linda Tropp of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And Dr. Tropp is the Nevitt Sanford Award winner for 2019 for professional contributions to political psychology. Professor Tropp is professor of psychology and brain sciences. She holds a PhD from the University of California at Santa Cruz in 2000. Her work seeks to understand how people's experiences as group members color their interpretations of intergroup contexts and their experiences for and experiences in relation with members of other groups. I was talking to her just before we came on and mentioning how timely it is, and she was expressing a sentiment I'm sure many of you feel, which is that we all maybe wish our work was slightly less relevant to the current moment because it helps us understand human suffering, and human suffering seems to be on the rise. She's especially interested in studying relations between members of groups that differ in status and power to understand how legacies of inequality and conflict shape their perspectives and motivations, and to specify mechanisms that can serve to promote both improved relations and social justice. Tropp has received numerous academic awards, too many to mention, but they do include the Eric Erickson Award for Distinguished Early Career Achievement from ISPP. She's authored or co-authored over 100 academic articles and chapters, multiple edited volumes, and a monograph. Her work has been cited, to my count, which I stopped counting, but something approaching or maybe exceeding 15,000 times to date. The award committee last year said of Dr. Tropp that she has lived up to the goals of the Nevitt Sanford Award, taking seriously the obligation to put her knowledge to work to the end of solving social problems. She's worked in many different parts of the world and in partnership with government and non-governmental organizations to develop and implement evidence-based interventions aimed at reducing intergroup tension and increasing intergroup cooperation. Our field needs people like Dr. Tropp, scholars who are driven by a genuine passion for social change and an unswerving commitment to making our world better through the rigorous communication and application of psychological research. So before I welcome Dr. Tropp to give her remarks, I'd just like to say, if any of you have questions for her during her talk, please feel free to enter those into the question box on the right side of your screen, and I will curate those and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can at the end. And please, if you could, put those in the room number one, be in room number one when you're asking those questions, so that if I can, they'll all be in one place. But if you put them anywhere else, I'll try to look for them as well. So please welcome Dr. Tropp as she speaks with us about ambivalence, about social relevance, reframing academic research, and reaffirming our commitment to the public good. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you so much, Nick, both for all you've done to convene this meeting virtually and for that incredibly kind and fairly embarrassing introduction. I decided to focus on this for my talk today in honor of the Sanford Award, and the question of whether and how academic research can make a difference in the real world is something I think a lot about. But I just want to make clear that I'm not the first person or the only person in psychology to care about these issues, and I just want to start by giving a little bit of an historical perspective. And I do apologize with the switch. There's a slight difference in formatting, so if things are cut off, I do apologize. But just to give you one example, George Miller, who was a past APA president, he stated that he couldn't imagine anything that would be more relevant to human welfare and nothing that could pose a greater challenge to the next generation of psychologists than to discover how best to give psychology away. And a generation later, Tom Pettigrew said that our society and world are faced with an array of threatening problems that deserve intense scientific scrutiny, and that social psychology has distinctive and important contributions to make to the analysis and remedies of some of these problems. And I couldn't agree with him more that our discipline has yet to apply the full force of its research and theory to social policy. And we might wonder, why is that? Why might we not have had the level of policy impact that we would ideally like to have? And as I reflect on this question, I can think of at least a couple of reasons why that might be the case. At least one of these has been offered by Dalton and Bazerman, who basically argue that as social and political psychologists, we might not always get credit for the contributions that we make. As they say, many behavioral economics insights are straightforward applications of ideas that were published in psychology decades before. And at the same time, I think that Dalton and Bazerman are correct to add that we as a field also have to take some responsibility for the relatively limited impact of our work, because as they note, typically academics are trained to be in love with their newest idea, whereas people more oriented toward policy and action are more interested in focusing on just knowing what works. And here I think is where we encounter some fundamental ambivalence in our field about the value of socially relevant research relative to what has traditionally been referred to as more basic research. And I think Doug Medin describes this ambivalence well when he writes that many of us in academia may be walking around with either an implicit or explicit basic is better attitude. And he presents the scenario where he says, you know, imagine two assistant professors coming up for tenure, and one has plenty of publications in psychological science, and the other has plenty of publications in applied psychological science, a hypothetical journal. And he says, you know, which of the two do you think has a better chance of getting tenure? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that hands down, it would be the former. And he goes on to say that dichotomies such as these that distinguish between basic and applied research are actually dangerous territory for us. And he provides an example of how, you know, if we're inclined to do psychological research that has high fidelity to real world circumstances, we might be accused of doing applied research. And I've added emphasis to the word he uses there, accused, because that's the type of term that we usually use when we want to prove that we're innocent of doing something wrong, such as doing applied research. And so I think Medina is right that for a long time, the social relevance of the work that we do has often been understood as being somehow at odds with doing good science or conducting rigorous research. And so in our quest, you know, to prove to ourselves and perhaps also prove to others that we're real scientists, we may have felt inclined or compelled to adopt the view that science needs to be fully objective or completely value-free. But using scientific research to address pressing social issues has a very long and rich legacy in social psychology in particular as a discipline. And on this point, my mind goes straight to Kurt Lewin, who stressed that it's not sufficient to do research simply for the sake of academic publication, but that ideally academic research would lead to some sort of action. Also, throughout the 1950s, psychologists such as Kenneth and Mamie Clark were very active as engaged scholars. For example, Ken Clark prepared a report on problems faced by racial minority youth as part of a US White House sponsored conference in which he summarized the very well-known Clark and Clark doll studies that he conducted with his wife and fellow psychologist Mamie Clark. And these psychologists, along with many others, prepared and signed on to the classic social science statement that summarized research evidence relevant to the Brown v. Board of Education cases that led to the desegregation of public schools in the United States. So, you know, from just very brief review, we can see that our field has a very long and rich legacy of conducting socially relevant research and finding ways to use our research to make a difference in society. But over a span of decades, it appears that we've become more concerned with what we might lose by conducting socially relevant research. So for example, you know, perhaps it's that we fear we might lose status or credibility in the field, or that we'll be taken less seriously as rigorous researchers if we focus on social relevance. Or perhaps we might fear losing control over how other people use or interpret our research findings as we attempt to give the research away, as Miller had suggested. Or perhaps just given the constraints and pressures that we're under as academics, we fear losing time and energy that might be reserved for other activities that seem better suited to enhancing the likelihood of our professional success. But, you know, as I reflect on these possibilities, I realized that as a field, we actually know a lot about what happens when we experience loss aversion, right? You know, we tend to focus more on what we might lose or bad outcomes as compared to focusing on the potential for positive outcomes. And this focus on the negative often reflects a fear of the unknown that kind of binds us to the status quo and inhibits our willingness to try new things. So then what do we do if we want to try to overcome some of those fears? Well, the research would suggest that we can adopt a different perspective or a different frame of reference to change how we think about what we might lose relative to what we might gain, and that we can also work to enhance our sense of efficacy and competence in the domains that are relevant to that work, because the more we are able to feel competent in those domains, the more prepared we are or capable we are of tolerating uncertainty. So correspondingly, what I would like to do for the rest of the time that I have to talk today is to concentrate on these two themes, to think about, you know, how we can shift our perspectives, to shift away from what we might lose to think about what we might gain from conducting socially relevant research, or what we might lose from failing to focus on the social relevance of our work. And also, I'd like to highlight some of the things that we can do to try to enhance our sense of efficacy and confidence as engaged scholars. So, to address this first question regarding what researchers can gain from focusing on social relevance, I think one thing we can gain is a greater commitment to and confidence in the replicability of our research findings. Because if we're hoping for our research to have impact and to share what we know with policymakers and communities, we want to make darn sure that we're confident in our results, right? So to give you some background, this was actually a main reason, part of the impetus for the meta-analysis that I conducted with Tom Pettigrew regarding the effects of intergroup contact on prejudice, because this project basically required us to find every study on intergroup contact that we could find that examined the relationships between intergroup contact and prejudice in order to see what the research literature would tell us overall. Now, granted, it took us more than 5 years to create the data set, but ultimately we were able to include more than 250,000 participants from 38 different countries in the final data set that we had. And what we find is that overall, overall, and in 94% of the cases, what we find is that greater contact between groups is typically associated with lower levels of intergroup prejudice. And I just want to give you a sense of what you're looking at here. So if you look at the X or horizontal axis where it says contact prejudice correlation, that's just simply looking at the association between contact and prejudice. And so in the middle of that X axis where you see the 0.0 mark, that basically would mean that there's no meaningful association between contact and prejudice. And then if you look to the left where there are negative correlation values, that's suggesting the relationship that greater levels of intergroup contact are associated with lower levels of intergroup prejudice. And each of those little blue dots in this graph represent one of those 500 plus studies of intergroup contact. And so you can see that the clustering of the cases is occurring on the negative side of that correlation scale, suggesting that greater levels of intergroup contact are typically associated with lower levels of intergroup prejudice. And the red line in the middle of that distribution represents the mean correlation or the mean effect size for all those cases, which corresponds to a correlation coefficient of about negative 0.21. So it's a relatively modest correlation in terms of magnitude, but it's a highly consistent effect across many different features and characteristics of our studies. And I just want to describe a couple of those characteristics briefly with you. And before I do so, I just want to walk through a sample graph so that you understand how to interpret the graphs that I'll be showing. So here now on the y-axis, you see those magnitudes of correlations where 0 in the middle would be that there's no meaningful relationship between contact and prejudice. Higher scores would mean that contact is associated with more prejudice, and lower scores would mean that contact is associated with less prejudice. And that bar corresponds to that red line that we saw in the middle of the distribution with a mean value of negative 0.21, suggesting that overall, across all the studies, what we see is that greater contact is generally associated with less prejudice. So as I was saying, we tend to see a great deal of consistency in the contact effects. And just to give you a couple of examples in bar charts, here we looked at whether contact typically reduces prejudice across different types of intergroup relationships. And we find that, yeah, very similar patterns of contact effects emerge in relation to many different types of target groups, ranging from contact between heterosexuals and members of LGBT communities, between people with or without physical or mental disabilities, between members of different racial and ethnic groups, and between people with and without mental illness. We see the same basic effect over and over. Very similarly, we also see very similar patterns of contact effects across many different types of contact settings, whether the contact occurred in more recreational settings, like after-school programs, boys and girls clubs, soccer teams or soccer leagues, things like that, whether they occurred in more controlled laboratory settings, in organizational or work settings, educational or school settings, or in residential or neighborhood settings, we consistently see the same basic trend. And so this type of consistency can give us a lot more confidence in the replicability of our findings across different intergroup settings and contexts. Now, at the same time as we can gain confidence in the consistency of our findings, thinking about the real-world relevance of the work that we do can also help us to broaden the scope of the research questions that we ask. And I think this is important, especially after having conducted the meta-analysis with Tom, because for decades, contact researchers were basically batting around the same question of whether contact does or does not reduce prejudice. And I think this body of work was usefully critiqued by some folks like John Dixon, Kevin Durheim, Colin Trudeau, and their colleagues, who emphasized that one of the limitations of the contact literature is that it has traditionally focused on changing prejudiced attitudes while having relatively little to say about how to promote social change toward greater equality. And I thought this was a valid critique, and that we needed to learn more about what intergroup contact could or could not do. So these authors invited me to join them as part of a collaborative project doing a national telephone survey of white South Africans, where we examined intergroup contact, racial prejudice, and racial threat all simultaneously as possible predictors for white South Africans' support for policies that would benefit Black South Africans. And here we looked both at their support for compensatory policies like training and education programs that would promote Black advancement, and also their support for preferential policies where there would be preferences shown for Black applicants relative to white applicants. And together what we found is that even after taking into account factors such as racial prejudice and racial threat, greater contact that white South Africans had with their Black counterparts still predicted greater support for policies that would serve the interests of Black South Africans. Now, more recently in the United States, we've also found across a number of studies with white Americans that the more contact that white people have with Black Americans, the more empathy they feel regarding what Black Americans experience. And in turn, the more empathy they feel, the more anger they report about how Black people in this country are treated. And this anger, in turn, both predicted their greater support for, as well as their reported participation in, collective action for racial justice. And these types of findings have led us to think about how contact between groups doesn't simply involve a change in our attitudes, as earlier generations of contact theory would have suggested, but that it can do something deeper that compels us to care about the experiences and the perspectives and the interests of people in the other groups whom we get to know. And what I especially appreciate about these new generations of contact research that we and other folks are doing is that they grew directly out of listening to other researchers' critiques about the research literature as it stood. And this actually relates to a third thing that I wish to highlight regarding what researchers might be able to gain from focusing on the social relevance of their work, and that is that it can keep us from becoming too wedded to our theories or to claims about the universality of our findings in light of critiques or in light of new research evidence. And I think about this in relation to another point that Dixon, Durkheim, and Trudeau had raised about the contact literature. And here they're citing John Barry, who's well known for his research on acculturation. And they highlight his saying that the contact literature has generally offered little guidance about how to achieve the positive effects of contact in places where racial segregation and inequality are deeply entrenched. And it makes total sense to me that they would have this view of the research literature, given that much of their work has been conducted in the South African context, where the legacy of apartheid would naturally color any efforts to promote positive contact or to promote positive intergroup outcomes from contact. And I get this at a very deep level because, you know, or for those of you who don't know, I was born and raised in Gary, Indiana, which is an industrial steel town in the Midwest of the United States, and which was a major site of Black migration from the US South up north. Gary's also known for having one of the first Black mayors in the United States, Richard Hatcher, who was the mayor throughout my childhood, and for hosting the National Black Political Convention in 1972 when I was very young. And at the same time, Gary was hit very hard by white flight, where as Black people started moving into Gary, white people started moving out. And there were great demographic shifts between 1960 and 1990, such that the city's entire economic infrastructure was absolutely decimated. And I remember as a kid, kind of the picture that you see on the right, that most of the downtown district was boarded up and just everything was dead. It was like a ghost town in what had been, that's Broadway, what had been downtown, the main part of downtown Gary. Rates of unemployment and crime skyrocketed, and particularly affecting members of the Black community who stayed as compared to affecting white people who fled. And having grown up witnessing this context of social division and economic inequality, like Dixon and colleagues, I too had started to question whether contact's effects would be comparable for everybody, or whether there might be important differences in the effects of contact depending on the status positions of the groups involved. And so, you know, at the same time that Dixon and colleagues were publishing their critique of the contact literature, Tom Pettigrew and I were starting to publish findings showing that the positive effects of intergroup contact on average are weaker among members of minority or historically disadvantaged groups as compared to the effects that we might observe among majority or historically advantaged groups. And then to see if I could replicate this finding, I conducted a secondary analysis of national survey data where I found the same basic effect, that is a weaker relationship between contact and intergroup attitudes among Black Americans relative to what was observed among white Americans. And this analysis also showed that a likely reason for this was the pervasiveness of racial discrimination. That in particular, Black respondents who perceived a great deal of discrimination against their group, which was more than half of the Black sample, among those Black respondents, there was no significant relationship between contact and intergroup attitudes, suggesting the prominence of racial discrimination that seemed to inhibit the potentially positive effect of contact among Black respondents in a way that would not be observed or go undetected if we only focused on white respondents. So taken together, I think these types of trends that I've been talking about really speak to the important insights that we can gain from attending to the real world relevance of our research findings, and the important insights that we might miss out on if we don't link our research to the real world, because we might learn new things about people and societies beyond what we might have predicted simply from existing theory. Now, of course, there's much more that I could say about these topics, but I do want to save at least a bit of time to talk about the second theme, that is what we can do to try to enhance our sense of efficacy and confidence if and when we choose to focus on social relevance, or if and when we choose to become more actively engaged in sharing research findings outside of academia. And I know, especially, under the present circumstances, it's not enough that we're in the middle of a pandemic, but the prospect of having real world impact may seem especially daunting when we think about doing so in the context of all the other things that are already demanding our time and attention as academics. So what are people like us, just with mere human capacities, supposed to do? I've found myself asking this question many times, both during my years as a graduate student and throughout my career as a faculty member. And at least for me, what I've come to realize is that at the end of the day, for many of us, the social relevance of the work we do is what got us into this work in the first place. And even more than that, I would say that finding ways to make our work useful by improving people's lives or contributing to the public good, that can give our work its own unique sense of meaning and offer its own rewards. But of course, it's up to each of us to choose and determine if or how this work of engaging with the real world fits in as part of our professional trajectory. And I think it's important for each of us to evaluate for ourselves the costs and benefits of doing so, because there are trade-offs. Engaging with public audiences outside of academia does take a lot of time and energy. But perhaps there's a way that we can re-envision this work, either as a complement to our science or as a way to bring us closer to some of our professional goals rather than necessarily pulling us away from them. Or perhaps as an opportunity to gain new or novel insights about the phenomena that we study, or to approach those issues from different angles than what we're accustomed to, rather than seeing scholarly engagement as some sort of burden or obligation. And so then if we do decide that we want to do more socially relevant work and really engage with real world issues and with public audiences, how we do so might look very different depending on who we are and what our professional goals are, as well as our personal philosophy regarding the role that researchers can or should play, such that some of us might want to act primarily as pure scientists, where our primary focus would be on disseminating scientific knowledge, just saying, this is what our data show. Some of us might be interested in serving as a science arbiter, where people might want to get our opinion about the state of the research literature or ask us about the validity of certain scientific claims. I saw that there was this article. What do you think about it? Do you believe it? Are there other things I should read? Some of us may be willing to serve as an honest broker, where people might ask us for guidance about how to interpret the research in terms of pursuing different courses of action. So, for example, people might be debating different policies or programs, and they might want to know the pros and cons of those different approaches based on what we know and our scholarly expertise related to the relevant literatures. And some of us might wish to engage as issue advocates, where we might be more vocal in advocating for a certain policy or position or program. And as I reflect on these possibilities, I've probably played any combination of these roles over the course of my career, depending on the issue and the context and the organizations involved. But ultimately, from my perspective, what I think is most important is that each and every one of us decide for ourselves the role or roles that we wish to play or that we're willing to play in relation to the issues that we study and in relation to the constituencies and communities with whom we work. Now, for anyone who might be interested in doing this type of work and becoming more engaged with certain real-world issues or sharing our scholarly expertise with non-academics, there are many different questions we might ask ourselves to guide us in this process. And I just want to walk us through a few of these. One key question in my mind concerns the issues that motivate us to do the work. And as we think about becoming engaged scholars, I've often found it useful, to ask oneself, like, if we could use our research to affect or bring about one change in the world, what would it be? What kind of impact would we most want our research to have? And then once we have a bit of clarity around that question, we need to think about what the key message we have to share is. What do we know about the issue that other people should know or need to know, given where or how they are situated? And as we ask ourselves this question, I think it can also be useful to reflect not only on our areas of expertise, the knowledge we have to share, but also on the goals and interests of the audiences that we're trying to reach, that we can use and really match our scientific knowledge and expertise to help them achieve their goals and to help them do their work better. And then the more we know about the goals of the people that we're communicating with, the more that can help us to gain clarity regarding our goals in communicating with them and in clarifying the scientific roles that we wish to play. So for example, we can think about, what are we trying to accomplish here? Are we simply trying to inform people about an issue? Are we trying to change their attitudes or behavior around an issue? Are we perhaps trying to cultivate a close, trusting, or long-term working relationship with them to pursue future joint projects or collaborations? You can imagine how we might approach the task of sharing what we know in very different ways, depending on the nature of our relationship or depending not only on their goals, but on our goals in communicating with them. Now, we might also approach this task of communicating knowledge differently depending on who we're trying to reach. And there are many different constituencies or audiences who could potentially benefit from our scientific knowledge, but depending on their goals and our goals, we might need to frame the issues or the way we approach these modes of communication really differently. So just to give you a couple of examples, when I'm working with civil rights litigators or talking to policymakers or presenting at congressional briefings, I'm happy to play the role of scientific expert and have them read off my, long list of academic credentials. But when I'm working in schools or when I'm talking to teachers, I often downplay the fact that I have a PhD. I kind of put that on a shelf somewhere and I just focus on what we care about as teachers, what we hope for our students, because it can be really off-putting to come in as someone who seems to be holier than thou, trying to talk to teachers who are already overtaxed doing their work. You can also think about how the interests of people or the different constituents in the slide are really different. So if you're talking to a policymaker, they're like, okay, I've got 2 minutes. What do I need to know? If you're working perhaps with community-based organizations, they want to know, like, can I trust you? Are you going to be here for the long term? Are you going to just take the data and leave? So the way that you engage with those different audiences can often be quite different, both in terms of content, but also in terms of style, demeanor. And so, recognizing that there are different ways of being effective in engaging with non-academics by framing the work and the scholarly expertise we have to offer in different ways is actually a large part of what led me to edit a book on public engagement for academic researchers, because so many of us haven't been trained to do this. And my goal here was really in the hopes of enhancing our sense of collective efficacy as we wrestle with how to frame what we have to say and what we have to offer in different ways, depending on the issue and depending on the audiences that we wish to reach. And at the same time as we seek to know our audiences better, I think it's also really useful for us to reflect on what we know about ourselves, to consider simple questions such as, what types of engagement activities interest me most? Do I want to speak? Do I want to write? Do I want to work collaboratively with people? What skills do I have to offer? How do I work best? Do I work well in the spotlight, or do I work better behind the scenes? And, I have to say, for me, I tend to prefer the types of engagement activities that are a bit more behind the scenes, especially things like sitting down with field directors or community-based organizations or civil rights litigators and trying to find the most compelling social science research to bolster their programs or to support their claims, kind of the academic equivalent of being a law clerk, rather than being in the limelight, such as serving as an expert witness or being a commentator on CNN. I'll give interviews in different media outlets, but it's more like a muscle that I've had to work on building as compared to being a more natural or comfortable space for me to work in. So there's many different ways in which we can become engaged with the real world as scholars, and it's really up to us to think about how we might wish to do so. And I also just want to highlight that there are many resources out there that can potentially support us in doing this type of work if we're inclined to do so, including both a series of books and a number of online resources. But for now, I would just like to conclude by saying that as academic researchers, many of us seek to focus on social relevance in the hopes of making a difference in the world. But we ourselves also have much to gain by focusing on social relevance, such as fostering the replicability and confidence that we can have in our research findings, gaining greater and novel insights into the phenomena that we study, and also feeling a deeper sense of meaning and confidence and efficacy in relation to the work that we do. And collectively, as social and political psychologists, I think we've only begun to cultivate the type of presence and influence that we could potentially have in the public sphere. And my hope is that by focusing on what we stand to gain and how we might become more effective in having broader public impact, will encourage more of us to pursue research questions of social relevance. So I will stop there to save some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was a really wonderful and enlightening talk about actually some of your work that I haven't read, which is the book that the edited volume you put together. We are getting questions which I'll relate to you. I just wanted to thank you again for all that you've done for the field, and to maybe as a selfish prerogative of the chair, I can ask the first question and then I'll get to everyone else. But I definitely, we have until 10 past the hour, my time, so, and everyone's time. So that gives us some nice space here. I've often thought about the differences between the two fields that form political psychology in this dimension, and whether or not political scientists really have different imperatives, and therefore would put different weights on the concerns that you have so carefully gone through about why you wouldn't want necessarily, or why you would want to have more social impact. And one example always pops into my mind that I share with my students, which is, imagine you're working on the causal antecedents of genocide, and you're comparing 2 or 3 different forces, like, say, boundary permeability, border permeability as a causal antecedent or factor for increasing or decreasing genocidal acts by governments around the world. And you think you have the right answer in your research, which has to obviously be observational in nature. We cannot randomly assign border permeability when these crises occur. And you think you have the right answer, but you would be very reluctant to share that with policymakers, because if you were wrong, you could actually make the problem worse. And this is obviously just one version of one of the points you raised, which is how will your results be used to make policy? Will it make the problems harder or easier to solve? Do you think of that across the line? I know you've worked mostly in psychology, but you have tons of interaction with political scientists. In our group, in ISPP, do you think that we have to put different weights on these factors that you're considering, or do you think they're really the same and we shouldn't make too much distinction between the two types of field?
I honestly don't know. I'm not trained as a political scientist, and so I don't want to presume that I could speak for your field. But some things that I have noticed just generally in academia is that in a lot of universities and a lot of departments, having public impact isn't necessarily valued, or it can be seen to almost hurt your record if you're doing too much out there and not enough scholarly writing. There's, I think, some status issues associated with it that I've seen across psychology and political science and like many different fields. So I think that is something that we all need to attend to. I also think, for me, part of it is also just a general openness to kind of other points of view or other angles of seeing things. I think in so many parts of academia, we're trained to elevate ourselves as all-knowing. The way we get grants is say, see how important I am. This is the contribution that only I can make. And I think we need a lot more humility and more of a collaborative spirit when we either engage in interdisciplinary work and or engage with non-academic audiences. And I actually think about, some examples that I've had not recently, but in past decades, when I've given talks to political science and public policy audiences, more in the peace and conflict realm, where people in the audience would listen, be very gracious during my talk, and then raise their hand gently afterward and say, yeah, but so what does any of this have to do with intergroup conflict? and, and I would say, well, different disciplines emphasize the micro and the macro. But from my perspective, if we were trying to establish peace accords between nations, I would want to know that the communities that are living under those national government orders have the same spirit, that there's not this roiling hostility that's just under the surface when you're saying that we're now at peace. So I really do see these things as working in tandem. And so I do think of it more as, am I just going to be wedded or focused to what I exclusively am interested in focusing on, or am I going to really try to get a sense of how other people think about the issues that I care about, how people are trying to implement programs related to the issues that I care about? Because in some ways, I think it's like empathy. It's kind of this like translatable skill, but that is generally how I do think about it.
Thank you. I think you would be really flattered by all of the questions and wonderful comments that you're getting, and I'll send those to you. But I do have a question coming in that's it says the following, and it's very relevant to what you just talked about. There is a growing emphasis on, quote, policy impact, unquote, and policy relevance as a requirement for successful grant applications. What's your opinion about the eventual impacts of this emphasis on relevance and impact in grant application requirements on the directions of the field? That's a very big impact. A big
softball.
Sorry.
I think of it in terms of, I just hope it's genuine and real, and that people kind of do their homework in thinking about this in meaningful ways. In addition to editing that book on public engagement, I co-direct the public engagement project at UMass, where it's a faculty-driven initiative that's been in existence for 10 years, and we basically offer panels and workshops to train and support faculty in disseminating their work with non-academic audiences, kind of going through in more detail some of those things that I walked through toward the end of my comments. Because I feel like it's great if faculty and academics of many stripes feel well equipped to do this work and are really committed to doing this work. I think it's fantastic that it's included. But if it's only done in the service of getting the grant and then not followed through upon, that makes me a bit sad. So I think, for me, I do some public engagement or engaged scholarship on my own, but then I also feel like it's really important to kind of change the norms of the field, in fact, when I was working on that edited book, the editor or the publisher wanted it to be a sole authored book because they're like, those sell better. And I'm like, I want this to be an edited book, so there's kind of like a collective norm established of lots of accomplished researchers who also do this, so we don't have to see these activities as being at odds with each other.
Well, yes, you are someone who lives the advice that you give, and I imagine in psychology it's even more so true than in political science, that edited volumes are not the most highly prized lines on your CV. And so monographs would be more so, but even less than these individual papers that you've written. So another question, thanks for a fascinating talk. Individual choice should always be there, but how can our academic institutions shift the incentive structure to increase the opportunities for more applied public engagement? It's a two-part question. This is from Sama Abdallah from Germany. And the second part is also, what is the danger of our research for being used for harm, which is essentially similar to the question I asked at the beginning. For example, the effectiveness of framing or persuasion techniques, and how do we manage that risk? You've answered that second question, I think, already, but maybe the first one, what can our institutions do to try
it is a huge question. And so, in addition to co-directing the public engagement project at UMass, there's this other entity that's part of our faculty senate called the Faculty Senate Council for Public Engagement and Outreach, and I happen to serve on that as well. And that entity has been effective in working with the university administration to have outreach activities represented on our annual faculty reports of activities. So I'm sure at many institutions, you're asked to basically say, what did you do this year, in a very detailed form. And so they accomplished a great first step by having kind of public engagement and outreach activities represented on that form. The shortcoming, as it has existed for a while, is just that it's kind of an open field. So it's like this open online box, whereas, you know, the number of publications that you have, or, you know, to list all of your grants and all of your conference presentations, those are very refined and granularly specified fields. The outreach activities field is just kind of this open box. So what we've been working on recently is trying to specify more closely. So is it being an expert witness? Is it, you know, giving a congressional briefing panel? Is it an op-ed or some other piece in a popular outlet? So that faculty know how to fill this in more effectively. And so there's more consistency and a logging of just how engaged our faculty are. Because I think the more we can show that not only we're doing it, but that it brings prestige to the institution. You know, I think many institutions, at least in the United States, like seeing their name in the New York Times, like seeing, especially public land grant universities, being able to say, we're giving back to the public, we're giving back to the Commonwealth. See, this is why we should receive state funding as an institution. I think we can try to leverage those benefits to the institution in a way that's really kind of a win-win for the faculty interested in doing this work and for the institution seeking to support their faculty in doing this work.
Thank you. Lots of great questions I'm getting. One is, can we get more in-depth knowledge of social phenomena if we move from a quantitative to a qualitative approach? And which paradigm might be useful to be applied across cultures? These days, students are also not attracted to social research. I'm not sure that's true for much longer. I know a lot of students are interested, but what is lacking in their training? Good to listen to you. Thanks, Wahida.
Oh, well, thanks for the question. I'm kind of a both and kind of gal more than an either or kind of gal. So I don't know that I would say qualitative would be more successful or appropriate. I think they're both really useful. And I've been working on an interdisciplinary collaboration for many years now with some people in political science and sociology, some who are more trained in qualitative work and some more trained in quantitative work, some in mixed methods. I'm definitely on the quantitative end of the scale, but I have the utmost respect for qualitative work. And, you know, I've been doing interviews in the field as part of this interdisciplinary project, and really learning just how long it takes to pull threads together. But from a quantitative standpoint, I've always kind of been this way as a researcher. I just think a lot of times if we create questions just simply growing from the literature, we kind of miss some of the nuance of people's lived experience. And so I'm very much a believer in pilot testing, in going into communities and asking people what they think of our questions before designing surveys. So even though I say I'm a quant person, I think, you know, over the course of a research project, integrating a variety of methods can actually help us create better quantitative questions as well. I think one of the challenges, I would say, especially for political scientists or people who do kind of historical data analysis, looking from the 1950s to the 2000s, for example, is you also want to have the same wording of the question, right? So I think that is one of the challenges, that as our social norms change, as our awareness of issues change, as we want to ask different questions, we also want to maintain some consistency. So I feel like, you know, maybe we can work at parallel on both of those goals over time.
That's a very nice way to put those challenges. I know many of us face those too. Here's another one here's another question. I just like the way the question is written, and it's on a similar topic, so you'll get to maybe explore some other aspects of your answer. Thank you for this passionate speech. The way I think about this is usually, quote, what a waste to bring together such amazing minds and do nothing that is socially relevant with them, unquote. Would you like to share your opinion about how one can be, and the issue around being a political activist while being a researcher in this field? And how can we make social and political psychology dignified and credible in the eyes of policymakers?
Oh my gosh. I so wish we were at the conference in person, because I want to have a coffee with the person. That's that question. We could talk for a long time. So I have so much to say. I'll try to make it brief. Okay, so I am passionate about the work that I do. I'm passionate about the issues that I study. And at the same time, I do not identify as an activist, as an individual, as a private citizen. I go to protests. I donate to different organizations. As a researcher, I don't identify as a, say, scholar activist. I think that might surprise some people, but I think it's actually very directly tied to the wording of the question, because I feel like my legitimacy as a researcher could be questioned. So what I try to do is study what I believe are socially relevant issues, but with like research rigor, so that as a kind of like a check to try to reduce the likelihood that that what I want to happen will necessarily happen with the data, right? Because there's always that temptation. And I think it's really important for us to maintain that distinction as we try to make our work more public oriented. And I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I was approached by a then government agency, or non-governmental, but had some government funding. Doesn't matter. Some agency that wanted to hire me and our grad students to do kind of evaluations of some programs related to intergroup conflict and reconciliation. And over the course of that collaboration, we received some pressure from the organization to change how we describe the findings in our final report of findings. And the graduate student who was working with me on the project was understandably distressed. And my take on stuff like that, and I think it illustrates my view, is the report that we submit to the organization, that's our responsibility. And it's our scientific responsibility to be as honest as possible. If things aren't working, we need to be honest about that, even if it hurts their prospects for funding. But then once they take our report, they can do whatever they want with it, and that's their responsibility. If they want to mischaracterize our findings, that's beyond the scope of our immediate influence. And so I think it's really important for us to have an understanding of our boundaries, what we are willing to do and what we aren't willing to do, what lines we are willing to cross, what lines we aren't willing to cross. And that's why I think each of us really has to think about what roles we want to play. Because some people are just like, I just want to report the data as is, and other people can do the advocacy. And other people are like, no, I feel more invested in these issues. I want to be out there. I want to help the organizations doing this work. And I think both have their place, but we really have to figure out what we feel comfortable with and where we draw our own lines in terms of our scientific roles and our scientific integrity.
You're getting a lot of love in the question, so I'll just mention one. Amazing, Linda, wonderful, and fascinating. I'll just say that. Another one is great talk. Thank you. It can sometimes be challenging to get acceptance by practitioners who are sometimes suspicious of people who do research and do not have any real life experience from the field. It may be even more pronounced when the researcher is a member of the majority society and wants to engage with NGOs representing minority groups. So this is a flavor of the kinds of questions we've been getting, and I'm sure you've thought about. Do you have any suggestions of how to overcome this sort of distrust?
I mean, again, I think to the extent that it's genuine, I think, and that people follow through, I think understandably, historically disadvantaged or underserved communities should be vigilant, should be suspicious of us. We should have to prove ourselves a bit. And I think, again, starting from a place of how well do I know the goals of the people I'm trying to reach or work with is really important. So just to give you an example, when I've done research in schools, like middle schools, I don't just say, these are the important questions to ask in the surveys that I want to give to your students. Will you give me approval to be here, right? I usually ask the principal and the teachers, why do you want this research in your schools? What do you think you can learn from it? Do you have suggestions for questions that should be included? Because sometimes it can almost be like a bartering relationship. I can actually help them accomplish more of their goals, right? Because they don't have the funding or the resources to do their own surveys. But if I can include some questions that are really relevant to things that they want to petition the school district or the state for, it's again a win-win for everybody. And so I really have seen, in many ways, these collaborations being partnerships to the extent that we're trying to work together to achieve mutual goals, but they're not the same as, say, like participatory action research. I'm not, for me, that's where I draw a boundary. As a researcher, I want to use the skills and expertise that I have in my field as it being more like an external evaluator as compared to having community input into the design of the study. But people feel differently about those things. But again, I think it's having humility, listening to others, perhaps as much or more than we talk ourselves. I think those go a long way, and then just keep showing up and showing that you've done the work, showing that you've tried to learn about, like I've read about, I've either read books or statistics or whatever on this community. I'm trying to learn more. Who should I talk to?
You make it sound so, I wouldn't say easy, but you make it sound so positive, and that this can really work. But I know that a lot of us, including many of the questioners, have tried to face these issues. And my own personal view is the world can be so frustrating when it comes to how to navigate these questions.
Can I say something about that before the next question? Because
it'll be the last question. So go right ahead.
Okay. Right ahead. So I basically, when I was starting to do this work as an assistant professor, and I was basically told, you're not going to get tenure doing that type of stuff, right? I basically just decided this is what's right for me. It's not the most strategic, or at least it wasn't at the time. It's just what I felt like I had to do to stay motivated, right? If I was only submitting grant proposals and papers for publication, I wouldn't have been able to sustain my involvement. But we all differ on that. So I just wanted to say it's not necessarily that it's easy, but it's totally doable if we're motivated.
Okay, so the last question really quick. We only have 2 minutes left. Thank you so much for the talk. Do you think even with good intentions and political motivations, even with good intentions, political motivations will hinder the scientific process and misconstrue reality? And if yes, what is the solution to this change? You and I live in the United States, and so it's a particularly poignant question for us right now, and I'll leave my editorializing at that.
Yeah, I mean, my first response to that is, right now there are many political realities. So I think we can think about the ones that we wish to bolster more than others. I have seen actual changes in budgets made in relation to some of the work that we've done. I've seen differences in Supreme Court opinions of different justices in response to the work that we've done. And when I say we, I mean collectively as a discipline, not me as an individual or my research team. So again, I totally hear the disillusionment and distance from formal institutional structures that was described in the presidential symposium. I hear that loud and clear, but I also feel that there's space for people to work outside the system and work within the system. Like, what are our skills? What are our strengths? And how can we leverage them to work toward positive change?
Well, that seems like a really wonderful way to end this session. Thank you so much, Linda, for your time.
Thank you.
We're really lucky to have you among us and your students and your colleagues. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your conference.
Likewise. Enjoy the conference, everybody.